Welcome, my friends. This is the day the Lord has made, and we're going to rejoice and be glad in it. If you are looking for a Bible study that is clear, coherent, and contextual, you've come to the right place. What I mean is, our little caravan of sightseers is going to be taking a clear spiritual journey into the deeper parts of God's Word. With the help of a multitude of counselors, we'll explore important subjects from these 66 books and stop at critical rest areas to add context. Yep, we're going to make sure our spiritual GPS is effective. So the car is gassed up, we've got our map, and the road ahead is waiting. This is Behold. Let's rock and roll. Welcome, beholders. My name is David, and for the last 30 years, I've been digging into the depths of God's Word while compiling Bible study guides for various Christian organizations. After 3 decades, it occurred to me, better late than never probably, to share these studies with a larger audience. That's you. We all know there was no YouTube, no Rumble, no Facebook 30 years ago, but now we have a tool that we can use to share the thoughts that may inspire deeper understanding. In this very first season of Behold, we're going to study the meanings hidden between the lines of Matthew 5, verses 3 through 10. These verses are better known as the 8 Beatitudes, and they are the starting point for Christ's ministry on earth, which is why they should be our starting point today. I don't want to sit here and spout surface interpretations of these 8 Beatitudes. You can get surface interpretations from Google, or worse, asking ChatGPT to conjure up talking points based on spiritual sources like Wikipedia and Reddit. We are going to use deep insights from the original inspired scriptures, which means digging into the original Greek and Hebrew meanings. But I promise you, these won't be boring studies on word origins. We'll be putting ourselves there on the mountain with Christ to explore these scriptures as they would have been understood by his audience. I firmly believe if we explore Christ's actual meaning, we'll gain a better understanding of his teaching and draw closer to what God's word has for each one of us. There are 8 Beatitudes found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. They are specific teachings delivered directly by Jesus Christ during the Sermon on the Mount. The word beatitude is from the Greek word beatus, which means blessed or blessed. In short, Christ is re-educating his disciples, primarily, about the key attitudes that would bring blessings from God and what those specific blessings would be. All right, let's run through briefly just a short list of these 8 Beatitudes from Matthew 5 as part of our overview. Verse 3 begins with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," then the mourners, then the meek, and then the fourth one is those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Those are the first 4. The second 4 begins with, "Blessed are the merciful," followed by the pure in heart, followed by the peacemakers, and last, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness." To the disciples and the very attentive crowd, these 8 statements would have provided guidance on how to live a blessed life. Guess what? This guidance was precisely the opposite of what the Jewish audience had been taught in the synagogue. So, here we have not only the initial boot camp teaching from Christ, but also a kind of declaration of war on the Jewish leaders, the Pharisees. There were a number of them in the crowd, and yes, these leaders took it quite personally. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, which we read about in Matthew 7, verses 28 and 29, we discover the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. Let's not dismiss this very last line of verse 29, not as their scribes. We have to understand that the scribes and Pharisees were co-conspirators. Think of the Pharisees as the CEOs, VPs, and directors of the synagogue. The scribes are the lawyers, and there were many lawyers in the synagogue. Christ addresses these leaders in the audience directly in Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. He says, I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, the lawyers and CEOs, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. What is Christ saying here? He's saying, look at these men among you who call themselves your leaders. They are not blessed. One biblical scholar goes so far as to say it is ultimately the Beatitudes that get Jesus crucified. It was the Sermon on the Mount and the laser-guided missiles we know as the Beatitudes that put Christ on the radar of the church leaders. Some Christians approach the Beatitudes as if they are merely common platitudes or cliches that have very little meaning because they've been so overused. There are hundreds of platitudes that we hear almost every day. Phrases like, every cloud has a silver lining, or don't put all your eggs in one basket, or the often quoted, patience is a virtue. Instead of seeing them as trite cliches, we need to dig into the actual teachings and meanings of Christ's words and how they work as life principles. We're going to discover they're like laser-guided missiles in the culture that Jesus was preaching to. These words are not what the Jewish audience expected to hear. They weren't simple platitudes. They were verbal explosions intended to shatter the prevailing doctrines taught by the scribes and Pharisees. Okay, so where do we begin with the parables? Did you know there are actually 38 parables told by Christ in the Gospels? And 10 of these, 38, are considered the keys to Christ's ministry. I'd like to focus on 8 of those 10 that directly reinforce the Beatitudes in Matthew 5. I believe they not only reinforce the Beatitudes, they also provide the next logical step in thinking, the next logical spiritual step toward the new covenant in the church age. A parable is much more than just a short story. It is a comparison between natural things and spiritual things. In fact, the Greek word parabole means comparison. The parables of Jesus broke down deep spiritual truth, so we'll focus on 8 of those 38 to dig even deeper into the Beatitudes and also to expand our knowledge of Christ's teachings throughout his ministry. Some of these parables are in Matthew, others are in Luke, but they're all extensions of the Beatitudes. Okay, much like we did with the Beatitudes, let's run through the brief list of 8 parables that we'll focus on during the coming weeks. We'll start with the rich fool, go to the tower and the king, and then the vineyard workers, and 4th is the rich man and Lazarus. The second 4 have 2 very familiar parables. We're going to start with that first one. It's the Good Samaritan parable, which everybody here knows, but let's try to dig a little deeper. Then move to the Pharisee and the tax collector, followed by the prodigal son, another very familiar parable, and then we'll end up with the 2 foundations. I'm going to use a number of object lessons throughout this series and other series in the future. Christ used object lessons in his travels, obviously, with the disciples to explain certain subjects, like the fig tree at the side of the road. Now, Christ used the fig tree to demonstrate God's judgment on those who failed to respond rightly to his message. If you remember, he made the fig tree wither and die. We probably won't encounter a fig tree in our journey, but there will be plenty of opportunities to learn from our surroundings. To explain the differences and similarities between the Beatitudes and the parables, allow me to use this particular object lesson. The 8 Beatitudes are a lot like sunflower seeds. Each Beatitude is a seed planted by Christ at the beginning of his ministry. Matthew 5, verse 1, begins with these words, when Jesus saw the crowds. Obviously, Christ had a growing following. He saw the opportunity to sow a few basic new covenant principles because there would soon be significant changes in the plan of salvation. If you've ever planted seeds, you know that some grow and others do not. The parable of the sower in Matthew chapter 13 uses this comparison, but that's for another time. The Beatitudes were seeds planted by Christ in this sermon and then cultivated further in the parables. The seeds were intended to grow into fully mature sunflowers, which could then be spread by the apostles into all corners of the earth. Think of the Beatitudes as seeds and the parables as growing and mature sunflowers. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ gives a clear description of the upcoming changes in God's plan for salvation. As the Son of God, Christ knew his divine purpose. Philippians 2, 5 through 8 tells us this. He existed in the form of God, but did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. Now, some versions use the word embraced. He emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Christ knew he was on the earth to perform the will of the Father, and that will was to become a sacrificial lamb for the sins of mankind. No longer would the Jews have to make sacrifices at the temple. That was the old covenant. Soon, it would be time for the new covenant to begin, and Christ spent his time teaching the chosen disciples the basics of this new covenant. It was these chosen men who would commit to making disciples of all the nations. There are 3 points that we can take in from this historical marker. The first point is that the Sermon on the Mount is transitional from Old Covenant to New Covenant. It would be difficult to change the ritual practices of 42 generations. But Christ's teaching remained consistent. He uses the words kingdom of heaven 32 times. Just in the book of Matthew alone, Christ's kingdom is not on this earth, it's in heaven. Christ is not a warlord, he is the Prince of Peace. In John chapter 18, Jesus is brought before Pilate. This is his first trial before Pilate, the highest-ranking Roman military commander at the time. Pilate asked Christ, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Christ did not back down. He first demanded witnesses, as was customary in Roman law, but then added, "My kingdom is not of this world. Yes, I am a king." He said, "You said it rightly. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth." The second point we see at this historical marker is the purpose of Matthew's gospel. His purpose is to present Christ as the Messiah. He is a Jew writing to Jews. Unfortunately, the Jews would think of him as a warrior Messiah, a military leader that they could depend on to defeat their Roman overlords. John 1:11 tells us that Christ came to his own, but his own did not receive him. But as many as did receive him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. How many of Christ's audience would be disappointed to discover he did not come to defeat Caesar? And the last point that we see here at this historical marker is that righteousness is a key theme for this entire sermon. Christ knows the ever-present worries of his audience. In the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, which is Matthew 6, verses 25 to 34, Christ says to the crowd, and specifically to his disciples, "Do not worry about your life." Then he lists a few things that they have become preoccupied with. What they will eat, what they will drink, what they will wear. Then he continues, "Your Father knows you need these things, but the more important things are his kingdom and his righteousness, And then all these things will be added to you. The Beatitudes provide the 8 keys, the seeds to his kingdom and his righteousness. If only his audience would accept them, meditate on them, and allow them to grow in their hearts and minds. Here's the real power, the electricity, the divine nature of these 8 Beatitudes. While these keys are given to us in Matthew 5, and Luke does give a shortened version, Christ nurtures these seeds in using parables shared with us in all 4 Gospels. It blew my mind when I saw this. If you want even more depth in our study of the relationship between the Beatitudes and the parables, you will find it in the Beholder podcast. We've gone from behold to beholder. Behold is a clear, coherent, and contextual study of God's Word. But the real beauty of God's Word is that the more you dig, the more understanding you can gain. The King James Version, 2 Timothy 2:15, tells us to study to show ourselves approved to God. It doesn't say skim or rely on ChatGPT. Beholder digs deeper, strengthening our spiritual GPS. I look forward to being with you the next time as we dig into the very first of these 8 Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What a fantastic way for Christ to start his ministry. As always, I welcome your participation in this discussion as we travel the road in separate cars, but listening to the same radio station. Until then, stay in the Word and make sure your spiritual GPS is effective.